I used to teach here, adjunct. It's been some years since I've been. Yeah, that's okay. It's been some years since I've been on campus, but it's fantastic to be back. So I'll start by just mentioning my book, Black Observatory. It came out about a year ago, long in the making, but it's finally here. So I do have this for sale afterwards if you're interested. I'm going to read a couple poems from the book so you can decide for yourself what you think. And those poems I'm going to read are on the one of the photocopies I handed out. I'm going to hand that to you real quick. Also, you'll see that one of the poems on one of the handouts is called Degrees of Gray in Phillipsburg, and that title seems very appropriate for today, the degrees of gray outside. Okay, so I'm going to start by summing up what my argument is going to be, and I'm going to read a little essay that I wrote about poetry, but I'm going to try to sum it up real quick so it's clear when I read it to you. Basically, I encountered these sort of ideas about poetry from these two different poets that I admire. And they're not the exact same idea, but they have a certain similarity to them, and they are ideas that I found helpful in my own writing, and that the more I wrote, the more I felt like they confirmed something about the experience of writing that I would have. And so the two poets who came up with these ideas are Richard Hugo and Elizabeth Bishop, both kind of mid to late 20th century American poets. And Richard Hugo wrote a book about poetry, which there are aspects of it that may be a little dated because he talks about what kinds of pencils he likes to use and other things that seem a little like it marks the book for something that was written in the 70s or 80s. However, the first several essays in the book I still find very relevant and helpful, and the name of the book is The Triggering Town, and so that's also kind of the name of this concept he has. And what it basically amounts to is he's trying to urge young writers to not worry about big ideas in poems, to not be preoccupied with trying to convey big concepts. But he wants writers to think small. And what he says is, start with a town, describe a town. And what he thinks is if you devote enough attention to the description of a town, that if you have big ideas to share, they will hopefully find their way into the poem more organically. And so he also says that he thinks that there are two subjects to a poem, and he calls the first the triggering subject, and the name of the book is The Triggering Town. And so it's the idea that you come up with some sort of external or specific kind of thing to write about, but then he has this idea of the generated subject, which is something a little murkier, but it's this idea that while you're writing, if you get into it enough, something will come about that you couldn't have foreseen ahead of time. And I guess you could say it's connected a little bit potentially to the subconscious mind, that we don't necessarily understand everything about ourselves and all the things we think and experience. And it's a kind of trust that that stuff can find its way into a poem if you're focusing in a way elsewhere with enough specificity. Elizabeth Bishop's idea, which is sort of summed up as the geographical mirror, is this idea that it's similar, and Bishop, when she first started writing, or first started publishing, was sometimes accused of being a writer of mere description. Later, after she won the Pulitzer Prize and all these other things that happened, a lot of people that had initially said that decided, oh yeah, I changed my mind. She's one of the greatest 20th century American poets. What Elizabeth Bishop's idea of the geographical mirror is about is that she believed that a writer needs to lose themselves in what they're writing about. And she talks about a sort of self-forgetfulness. And so for her, often that was describe, get very into describing something you're looking at. And now, the example poem by her that I'm going to read is called At the Fish Houses, and it's set in a landscape. So like Hugo's town, it's a place, right? And so that's in a way what I'm talking about, is these sort of landscape poems. But her idea was, I mean, that poem that I'm going to look at, it does start with description and then find its way to a deeper meditation on larger subjects. But Bishop even believed that amid the description, material that goes deeper can emerge and actually be kind of embedded in the description. And essentially, to sum up in the poem I'm going to read, it's a reflection on death and the impending, you know, she's considering her own mortality and the mortality of everything, which leads her ultimately to a meditation on what do we do in the face of that? What does that mean, okay? So, time permitting, I'm going to read some of my own poems that sort of exemplify this, but let me start by reading this little essay that I wrote, and I hope that sort of prefatory stuff that I just said will make this more understandable. So I called it Triggering Towns and Geographical Mirrors, Richard Hugo, Elizabeth Bishop, and the Landscape Poem. The subject of this talk is the landscape poem, essentially a poem that focuses largely on describing a place. This might seem a simple concept, yet this type of poem can take different forms and can serve the poet and the reader in different ways depending on the form it takes. We'll look at some examples of modern landscape poems and even discuss the origin of the genre, but we'll focus on two things primarily: Richard Hugo's concept of the triggering town and Elizabeth Bishop's idea of the geographical mirror, as well as the work that best encapsulates this idea, her poem, At the Fish Houses. Ultimately, I'm arguing that writing a poem that describes a landscape provides an opportunity not only to present compelling descriptions, it also creates a framework that can allow the poet to explore deeper content while maintaining, to use Hugo's words, a base of operations for the poem. That deeper content might be emotional, psychological, political, or philosophical, but the point is that the meditation is grounded in a place and thus feels real. In his book of essays about writing, The Triggering Town, Richard Hugo argues that a poem has two subjects: the initiating or triggering subject, which starts the poem, and the real or generated subject, which the poem comes to say or mean, and which is generated or discovered in the poem during the writing. While the generated subject is, for Hugo, the ultimate goal, it can generally only be reached by first engaging with an appropriate triggering subject. Hugo informs us that for him, the triggering subject that often helps him find his way to the generated subject is a small town that has seen its better days. He explains that, quote, when you are honest to your feelings, that triggering town chooses you. What Hugo is saying is that he wants his poems to be about important subjects, but that often the best way to achieve that is not by running head-on towards those big subjects. Rather, the poet should, in his words, think small. He adds, if you have a big mind, that will show itself. While thinking small can take many forms in a poem, Hugo goes on to introduce the idea of writing about a specific triggering town or initiating location that will stimulate the poet's imagination. But why would the poet write about a remembered or imagined location? Shouldn't she be busy communicating her ideas? To this question, Hugo responds, I caution against communication because once language exists only to convey information, it is dying. In a way, Hugo is rewriting William Carlos Williams's maxim, no idea but in things, to read no ideas but in places. Of course, not all of Hugo's poems are about small towns that have seen their better days, but some are, and what we're focusing on here is the value of writing about a specific place that will lead the poem to a generated subject that the poet would probably not have accessed through a more direct approach. The landscape poem has a long place in Western poetic tradition. Corey Marks explains that the critic M.H. Abrams coined the term the descriptive meditative structure to describe a type of poem practiced by Wordsworth, Coleridge, and other Romantic poets. Abrams describes how this type of poem works. The speaker begins with a description of a landscape. An aspect or change of aspect in the landscape evokes a varied but integral process of memory, thought, anticipation, and feeling, which remains closely intervolved with the outer scene. In the course of this meditation, the lyric speaker achieves an insight, faces up to a tragic loss, comes to a moral decision, or resolves an emotional problem. Often the poem rounds upon itself to end where it began, at the outer scene, but with an altered mood and deepened understanding, which is the result of the intervening meditation. Classic examples of this poetic structure include Wordsworth's lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey and Coleridge's This Lime Tree Bower My Prison. Marx informs us that though this poetic structure is one of the significant lyric inventions of the Romantic period, it nevertheless also has roots in religious devotion and the poems that grow out of that devotion. However, in discussing the merits of the landscape or triggering town poem, a modern adaptation of the descriptive meditative structure, Hugo approaches the subject with a light touch. He wants the poet to have fun imagining a strange town that may or may not lead eventually to a meditation on an important matter. He wants the poet to let his own obsessions or curiosities guide him through the landscape to arrive wherever he will, as long as the poem remains interesting. So I'm going to read Richard Hugo's, this is probably his most famous poem. It's called Degrees of Grey in Philipsburg, and if you have the handout, it's on there. And this is a poem that really exemplifies him starting with a town, but that it leads then to a sort of generated subject. Degrees of Grey in Philipsburg. You might come here Sunday on a whim, say your life broke down. The last good kiss you had was years ago. You walk these streets laid out by the insane, past hotels that didn't last, bars that did, the tortured try of local drivers to accelerate their lives. Only churches are kept up. The jail turned 70 this year. The only prisoner is always in, not knowing what he's done. The principle supporting business now is rage. Hatred of the various grays the mountain sends, hatred of the mill, the silver bell repeal, the best liked girls who leave each year for Butte. One good restaurant and bars can't wipe the boredom out. The 1907 boom, 8 going silver mines, a dance floor built on springs. All memory resolves itself in gaze. In panoramic green, you know the cattle eat, or 2 stacks high above the town, 2 dead kilns, the huge mill in collapse for 50 years that won't fall finally down. Isn't this your life? That ancient kiss still burning out your eyes? Isn't this defeat so accurate? The church bell simply seems a pure announcement. Ring and no one comes? Don't empty houses ring? Are magnesium and scorn sufficient to support a town? Not just Philipsburg, but towns of towering blondes, good jazz, and booze the world will never let you have until the town you came from dies inside. Say no to yourself. The old man, 20 when the jail was built, still laughs, although his lips collapse. Someday soon, he says, I'll go to sleep and not wake up. You tell him no. you're talking to yourself. The car that brought you here still runs. The money you buy lunch with, no matter where it's mined, is silver, and the girl who serves your food is slender, and her red hair lights the wall. My objective is not to provide a definitive critical analysis of this poem. It's only to suggest that while the poem is initially largely about the town, it manages to generate interesting content that transcends mere description. In fact, the transition in the fourth stanza from the town to the speaker is overt. Isn't this your life? In other words, aren't you essentially this town? Isn't the death of the silver boom in a way the same thing as the distance in time from that last good kiss? But somehow the town feels like it is not just a cheap setup for the subsequent meditation. Likewise, the meditation is not so different from the description of the town that the language goes flat. The questions are interesting. Don't empty houses ring? Are magnesium and scorn sufficient to support a town? Hugo tells us the words should not serve the subject. The subject should serve the words. Earlier, I used the phrase mere description. This phrase was often used to describe Elizabeth Bishop's poetry before so many people decided she was a genius. Before considering Bishop's concept of the geographical mirror, I want to look at a landscape poem by the German poet Georg translated by Daniel Simcoe. This poem appears to describe a landscape without ever transitioning into a meditation or a reflection. So this is also on the handout, the next poem, Landscape. September evening, the calls of the shepherds make a mournful sound through the twilit village. Fire sputters in the foundry. A black horse rears violently. The servant girl's hyacinth locks long for the fervor of its purple nostrils. At the edge of the forest, a doe moans quietly, and the golden flowers of autumn lean silently over the blue face of a pond. A tree is consumed by red flames. Bats flutter up with dim faces. This early 20th century poem appears to merely describe a landscape. The title Landscape does not help us in our attempt to wring deeper meaning out of the poem. Trackle died of suicide at 27 in 1914, the year William Carlos Williams' first book appeared. I connect these two writers only because the radical absence of reflection in Landscape bears some similarity to the deliberate absence of ideas in some of the Imagist poems Williams wrote. However, it does seem that despite the absence of explicit reflection or meditation in Trackle's poem, psychological content is nevertheless conveyed through the images. Again, I don't aim to provide a definitive interpretation. However, though the speaker never mentions himself, we nevertheless sense his sadness. The line, the shepherds make a mournful sound, and his fear, a black horse rears violently. The lines, the servant girl's hyacinth locks long for the fervor of its, meaning the horse's purple nostrils, are surreal before the birth of surrealism, and they suggest a hint of madness amid the speaker's otherwise sober descriptions. I'll leave it to you to consider the implications of the poem's final lines, but this poem of mere description actually conveys a compelling psychological portrait of the speaker and is therefore not really mere description. Now let's consider Elizabeth Bishop's At the Fish Houses. Again, Bishop was initially criticized for writing poems that merely describe. At the Fish Houses certainly concerns itself with description. However, often when Bishop is describing, she's simultaneously doing more than just describing. Helen McNeill remarks that Bishop's poetry begins in observation and adds, for Bishop, the most important prerequisite for all discovery is self-forgetfulness, a giving over of oneself to whatever is glimpsed. Bishop herself comments on her aesthetic by saying, "What one seems to want in art, in experiencing it, is the same thing that is necessary for its creation, a self-forgetful concentration." What Bishop is suggesting is that to be truthful in poetry, one must, in a sense, forget oneself. One way to do this is to allow oneself to get caught up in description, and in the case of At the Fish Houses, in the description of a place. So let's look at that poem. I will read it. It's the longest of the three. Okay. At the Fish Houses. Although it is a cold evening, down by one of the fish houses, an old man sits netting his net in the gloaming almost invisible, a dark purple-brown, and his shuttle worn and polished. The air smells so strong of codfish, it makes one's nose run and one's eyes water. The 5 fish houses have steeply peaked roofs, and narrow cleated gangplanks slant up to storerooms in the gables, for the wheelbarrows to be pushed up and down on. All is silver. The heavy surface of the sea, swelling slowly as if considering spilling over, is opaque, but the silver of the benches, the lobster pots and masts scattered among the wild, jagged rocks, is of an apparent translucence like the small old buildings with an emerald moss growing on their shoreward walls. The big fish tubs are completely lined with layers of beautiful herring scales, and the wheelbarrows are similarly plastered with creamy iridescent coats of mail, with small iridescent flies crawling on them. Up on the little slope behind the houses, set in the sparse, bright sprinkle of grass, is an ancient wooden capstan, cracked, with 2 long bleached handles and some melancholy stains like dried blood, where the ironwork has rusted. The old man accepts a lucky strike. He was a friend of my grandfather. We talk of the decline in the population and of codfish and herring while he waits for a herring boat to come in. There are sequins on his vest and on his thumb. He has scraped the scales, the principal beauty, from unnumbered fish with that black old knife, the blade of which is almost worn away. Down at the water's edge, at the place where they haul up the boats, up the long ramp descending into the water, thin silver tree trunks are laid horizontally across the gray stones, down and down at intervals of 4 or 5 feet. Cold, dark, deep, and absolutely clear, element bearable to no mortal, to fish and to seals. One seal particularly I have seen here evening after evening. He was curious about me. He was interested in music. Like me, a believer in total immersion. So I used to sing him Baptist hymns. I also sang, "A mighty fortress is our God." He stood up in the water and regarded me steadily, moving his head a little. Then he would disappear, then suddenly emerge almost in the same spot with a sort of shrug, as if it were against his better judgment. Cold, dark, deep, and absolutely clear, the clear, gray, icy water. Back, behind us, the dignified, tall firs begin, bluish, associating with their shadows. A million Christmas trees stand, waiting for Christmas. The water seems suspended above the rounded gray and blue-gray stones. I have seen it over and over, the same sea, the same slightly indifferently swinging above the stones, icily free above the stones, and then the world. If you should dip your hand in, your wrist would ache almost immediately. Your bones would begin to ache and your hand burn, as if the water were a transmutation of fire that feeds on stones and burns with a dark gray flame. If you tasted it, it would first taste bitter, then briny, then surely burn your tongue. It is like what we imagine knowledge to be, dark, salt, clear, moving, utterly free, drawn from the cold, hard mouth of the world, derived from the rocky breasts forever, flowing and drawn, and since our knowledge is historical, flowing and flown. One notices that roughly 3/4 of the poem consists of description of the landscape, the old man, the seal, the water, etc. Towards the end of the poem, out of the description of the water, a strange philosophical meditation emerges. The water is not really like water, since it's described as feeding on stones and burning with a dark gray flame. The water is, we're told, like a transmutation of fire. Then the speaker said, "It is like what we imagine knowledge to be." Clearly, the poem has taken a turn away from description and into philosophical meditation. However, I want to suggest that even at the beginning of the poem, when the speaker observes the fish tubs that are completely lined with layers of beautiful herring scales, she is not just describing. She is also thinking about death, since the herring scales are only there because the fish are dead. And she is thinking as well about beauty and the fact that it is somehow deeply associated with death. Wallace Stevens famously said, "Death is the mother of beauty." Closer analysis reveals that this meditation on mutability and death continues as the speaker looks at the capstan, which is cracked and covered with melancholy stains like dried blood. Likewise, the discussion of the decline in the population, or of the pine trees just waiting to be harvested. So many details reveal the preoccupation with death and decay on the part of the speaker. Even the humorous exchange with the seal seems on topic when one considers that the speaker sings to it, "A mighty fortress is our God." I'm not suggesting that the speaker believes in the mighty fortress, only that in the face of impending death, the thought of God arises. There are many more details to analyze, but all of this is to suggest that the meditation at the end of the poem arises out of a sustained engagement with the landscape and the thoughts it begets in the speaker about mutability, death, and beauty. Bishop's idea of the geographical mirror is essentially embodied in the poem's statement, "All is silver." In other words, Bishop believed that if the poet commits to total immersion in the scene, she can glimpse a true vision of herself there in the details, but paradoxically, she will find herself only by losing herself in self-forgetful concentration. Thus, at its best, the landscape poem can be a forum not only for beautiful description, but also for meditation, reflection, and even self-discovery. Okay. Thank you. I'm keeping an eye on the clock here, but it gives me a little time to read. Now, of course, I did what, I used to play in a band, and so I should know about like following an act before. I've put myself in the position of following Elizabeth Bishop by reading my own poetry, which is probably not wise, but oh well. But I will read, let's see, one or two of my poems that are set in a landscape that I think embody a similar approach to the ones I looked at here. Let me take a sip of water real quick. I guess I'll first read this one called The Haunted Coppice for those of you with the photocopies. Coppice, by the way, is kind of a woods, basically. It's another word for woods here. The Haunted Coppice. At the end of the dead-end lane, clogged with burr-shagged tangles and pricker-studded stems, within earshot of the trickling rivulet that probes the margins of the warehouse district, one encounters the inauguration of a path. At first, it's just a strip of moss between rotting logs infested with termites. Then a discernible track of packed dirt snakes through fern growth under rioting constellations of gnats. Finally, a clear trail appears and hugs the rim of a culvert. It meanders indecisively through larch shade before diving underground and emerging in a chirping thicket. I strolled that track many times in my youth, slicing at skunk leaves with a switch, inventing with my comrades frightening myths that peopled the coppice with oracles and outcasts. One tale followed the exploits of a deceased soldier who wandered the forest in search of his misplaced sidearm. When my friends and I found a petrified boot amidst thistle, we recalled that somnambulant grunt. A neighbor's spaniel would accompany us, sniffing the trail, scurrying forward before pivoting to make sure we followed. Didn't that trail lead to the black observatory that hummed like a power station beside a secret landing strip? Didn't an estuary appear through foliage, its cobalt waters cleaved by a white yacht's hull? Colin, in his brogue, claimed the yacht transported papyrus scrolls scribbled with esoteric maxims. I said the crew passed a chalice infused with the blood of a sacrificed saint. We argued until dusk, then we got lost. Only the shining arc lamps saved us. At table with my parents, I sipped from my chalice, my hair smelling of ferns. And I'll close by reading this poem called Homecoming. At the edge of town, you pass a water tower beside train tracks. A shopping cart blocks your path. The telephone poles have no wires. Someone has spray painted "fuck yo" on the train station. A breeze bathes your face as seed pods click overhead. How long's it been since you sat in a theater? The marquee says Jaws, but the ticket booth's empty. The jewelry store says 40% off wedding rings. Brass clips clink against the flagless pole. The library is a house that's rumored to be haunted. The librarian recounts tales of the first settlers' deaths. She's seen books flung from shelves, a woman at the bottom of a staircase. You pass a garage where mechanics yammer. At the nursery, a sprinkler douses the curb, leaving shrubs parched. A Corvette peels out in a mini-mart parking lot. Smoke drifts over storefronts. At the Dairy Queen, a woman buys cones for kids. She snaps at them, but they remain buoyant. At the football field, boys run plays. The pot-bellied coach shouts, "Let's see some hustle." Cheerleaders practice a coquettish dance. A middle-aged man watches them. The principal? Past the ShopRite, the drugstore, the family restaurant, the graveyard's as quiet as moss on stone. Weather has worn away some names and dates. Vandals have defaced a magnate's bust. As a child, you wondered about what's underground. Decaying uniforms from the Revolutionary War, a soil-streaked skeleton, ring still on its finger. One plot is new. The sod is fresh. Thank you. I mean, first of all, I'm not an expert on Wendell Berry, but I've read some of his stuff, and I will say I do think his philosophical outlook is quite different than, let's say, well, I would say both Bishop and Hugo. First of all, I think he's definitely a believer, religiously speaking. He's a Christian, and
although very unorthodox.
True.
Yeah.
But Elizabeth Bishop decidedly is not.
Yeah.
I mean, I think she follows in the sort of path of Wallace Stevens in a way, which is part of her project, is in a world where, you know, she didn't believe that. In fact, in that poem, I feel like after she's, in the poem that I read, she's considering the fish scales, and she does see the beauty. She describes one of the scales as like a sequin. You know, that's clearly signaling that she sees beauty in this. But as her mind is considering the different things around her, the knife is worn out, all the things that will succumb to decay or death in some way. I read a critic's article about this poem in which, when her gaze goes to the capstan, which is, you know, that thing that you turn to wrap a rope around it. It has two arms out like this. It's wooden. This critic is arguing she's thinking of the crucifixion. It's described as having dried blood stains on it. But then she goes to the thoughts of the trees, which she describes like Christmas trees waiting to be cut down. And this critic was arguing that I might be getting away from your question here, but it was the thing of and then she goes to the thing of the hymns and the Baptist hymns. And it's a way, this critic was arguing that she's longing, wishing that she had something that would be like her fortress. Except ultimately she rejects it because she just doesn't believe there is that thing. But then the meditation at the end about the transmutation fire, another critic argued that is somehow related to the philosophy of Heraclitus, which he was the philosopher of the you can't step in the same river twice, all is change. And so it's a way of, like, she's trying to make sense of the universe in that poem in some way. Her sense of the universe is very different than Wendell Berry, and so I don't know if I can sum up what he's all about or something like that. But I would just say there would be a very good reason why their approach to poetry would be very different. Yes, I mean, I guess I had the thought, you know, leading up to giving this talk, I make the point in there about saying. To say that, I say that Hugo in a way is almost suggesting no ideas but in a place, which is a play on William Carlos Williams famously said, no ideas but in things. No, you could replace the place with a thing. You know, this, in a way, some of the same ideas are true if you decide, I'm going to write about an object. That is something else you can get lost in. And Bishop has that famous poem, The Fish, where she's all focused on the fish. But over time, you start to realize there's something about the speaker in this poem, because she sees very specific things in that fish. And then if you get into her biographical stuff, I couldn't help but start to wonder, on some level, is she talking about herself? With this fish, because it's a real survivor that's been through lots of things, which is very much what her life is like. I would say in describing the people, it's a very similar thing, which is it's like the triggering town. Start with something very specific and let that be the focus that's going to distract you from worrying about the big ideas. But the hope is if you really engage and you keep the language very alive and interesting, that what you have to say that's in there somewhere will find its way out, rather than trying to start with some big concept. I know that when I first started writing poetry, sometimes I would have some big idea. I want to illustrate this idea. And it was just often a dead end because, you know, because like Hugo says, it's not just about communicating. It's about the language and the play of the language. It has to be interesting. There has to be texture and fun and surprise and, you know, that kind of thing. And the hope is that what you have to say is going to be there. It's just going to take getting involved in it for it to come out. Well, and the surrealists were very influenced by Freudian psychology and, you know, or other modernist poets, and the idea was this belief that there's a deeper realm to mine, but that you don't start out looking at the blank page and you immediately have access to it. You have to get into things a little bit. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.